What would you say is the most important invention of the last 100 years? Perhaps it's the airplane, the computer, or the iPhone. Well, before electricity, the sun was the only light source around sunset. If you wanted to travel after dark, you'd need someone to guide you. Imagine if Uber drivers didn't have GPS, they'd need a human navigator. Okay, they weren't real monsters, but superstitious people believed all sorts of creatures roamed the night. These included witches, ghosts, vampires, and werewolves. It wasn't too hard to believe these things existed either. That's because nightlife was a bit different back then. Guides would take people to haunted locations and tell spooky stories. Life before electricity became safer, more fun, and a whole lot brighter. But speaking of brighter, it's time to wrap up this video. So let me ask you, what's your favorite invention from the last 100 years? Let me know in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching. I think it's safe to say that tourism is one of the few industries that has remained steady throughout history. For example, people would attend all sorts of shows. These included operas, puppet shows, and even magic shows. Heck, you could even see famous scientists demonstrate their inventions. It was a great way to spend an evening. Of course, there were also parties, balls, and banquets. These events were normally reserved for the rich, but sometimes poor people got invited too. If you were a servant, it wasn't uncommon to get an invitation if your master was going. But even if you weren't invited, you could still sneak in. That's because during big parties, servants would sneak food or drink into the venue. Oftentimes, there were mobs of people waiting outside trying to sneak in. That's because many of these legends were based on real events. For example, rabies made dogs act like wolves and attack people. Then you had mental patients who escaped hospitals and committed horrible crimes. Doctors weren't sure why this happened, so they labeled it lycanthropy. That's Greek for wolf disease. There were even rumors that a werewolf killed a woman in England. This event inspired the legend of the beast, of which supposedly killed hundreds of people. Now, these stories probably spread because people didn't know what else to blame. After all, they didn't know about viruses or bacteria. The thing is, as time went on, people came up with scarier and scarier stories. Soon, there were claims of entire villages being wiped out by a werewolf. So not only would it be super slow, but you'd probably get lost. Well, at least they thought it was a werewolf. See, this guy had a hunchback and some body hair. So they put him on trial and tortured him to death. They hung him, but when his body was examined, it showed no signs of a beast. Basically, it was a human. But this shows how frightening the night was back then. People would do anything to protect themselves. Well, that's what traveling at night was like without streetlights. All of these items were supposed to ward off monsters. Of course, they didn't work, but people believed they did. Speaking of protecting yourself, what about fighting back against monsters? Some people kept weapons at their bedside, like sticks or knives. But others took things a step further. They'd keep live animals in their house to fight off monsters. I know it sounds crazy, but it was common to keep snakes, toads, or even monkeys. But these days, you're more likely to call the police than battle a werewolf. You were completely reliant on other humans who knew the area. Of course, some places had lanterns, but these days you might wait 15 minutes between street lamps. So it'd be like walking through the woods, except in the middle of the city. People started lighting up their homes with torches or simple oil lamps. But actually, this isn't true. Sure, crime existed, but it wasn't rampant. Back then, most cities didn't even have police forces. They'd just hire guards to protect certain areas like banks. Also, the vast majority of crimes weren't violent. For example, there was a huge black market for piano wire. Why? Because people would steal pianos and saw them apart. The metal was worth a lot of money. There were also pickpockets, of course, but compared to today, there weren't really dangerous criminals. There were no serial killers, no gang violence, and there wasn't even much drunk driving. That's because most people didn't drink alcohol. The reason is prohibition. I know it sounds crazy, but back in the 1800s, many states banned alcohol. The idea was to reduce poverty and family problems caused by drinking. So technically, you weren't allowed to sell, buy, or even transport alcohol. Of course, people still drank, but it forced them to get creative. Homemade alcohol was common. People would mix things like potatoes and yeast, then let it ferment for days. This created something called poteen. It was basically moonshine, and it was often very strong, sometimes over 70% alcohol. Don't worry, wasn't dangerous because people only drank it mixed with milk.
Wait, what?
Yep, they'd add milk to cut down its strength and taste. But honestly, this stuff tasted so bad that it was called the national disgrace. Many people simply preferred not to drink. They'd use fat from animals or whale oil, which wasn't cheap. Most poor families had only one lamp that they'd use for important tasks. A candle was a bit better because they were cheaper and easier to make, but they didn't last long and could start fires. You also had to buy special candles specifically made to last longer. These were called candle-abbers. But there is an invention that changed everything. In fact, it made modern life possible in ways you probably never thought about. It's something we take for granted every day, but life before it was a very different world. It all comes down to what your nights looked like before electricity. You know how right now you can turn on a light at any hour and see clearly. The darkness wasn't just inside your home, it was everywhere. Now, a lot of people believe that life before electricity was way more dangerous, full of robbers and things. Even though there wasn't much crime, nighttime was still scary for another reason. It was full of monsters. But here's the craziest part. Some people actually hunted werewolves. In fact, they captured one. For example, some people wore special clothing. They'd carry garlic, silver, or holy water. If you were lucky enough to survive the monsters, you could go out and have fun. And let's not forget about ghost tours. These were extremely popular back then. But all of this changed when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb.